Hey everyone, and welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going to be diving into learning patterns. And this guide, well, it claims it can turn you into like a JavaScript whiz.
Sounds ambitious.
All right. Now I know what you're thinking. JavaScript, patterns. Is this thing just for like hardcore coders? And
Oh,
well, the answer is kind of yes and no. Yeah, it's true that learning patterns, it's got a lot of code in it. But even if you aren't exactly fluent in JavaScript, we're going to like extract these golden nuggets of logic, the stuff that makes modern web apps really tick.
the secret sauce, so to speak.
Exactly. We're talking about these elegant solutions to those, head-scratching problems that developers face all the time.
hmm
Reusable blueprints for like building those amazing web experiences.
It's all about working smarter, not harder.
100%. And you'll even be able to throw around terms like, I don't know, singletons and proxies. Like you've been doing this for years.
I've always said that design patterns are like secret decoder rings for the digital world,
I love that. It's like having this X-ray vision into how things actually work
right?
and to help us navigate this awesome but maybe a little intimidating world. I've got our tech guru expert speaker back on the show.
Always a pleasure to be here. This guy, it's a gold mine of insights, really.
So, expert speaker, let's jump right in. Why should anyone even care about these learning patterns? Is it just about like making the code look prettier, or is there a bigger picture here?
That's a great question. So, yeah, it definitely helps you write cleaner code, but it goes way beyond that. Think of patterns as these like proven solutions to problems, like recurring problems in software development, right? They're like these time-tested blueprints that help you build applications that are, more robust, more efficient, easier to maintain, all of that.
Okay, so it's about like not reinventing the wheel every time you start a new project.
Exactly. And when you use these like established patterns, your code becomes way more understandable to other developers, which is, let me tell you, absolutely crucial in the world of software.
So it's like having this shared language, a way for everyone to be on the same page.
Precisely. The shared understanding, it streamlines collaboration, it reduces errors, and ultimately, it helps us build better software.
That makes a ton of sense. Now, I'm dying to unlock some of these secrets. What are some of the like key patterns that are highlighted in learning patterns?
Ooh, there are so many good ones. But let's kick things off with one that's both like fundamental to how we build things and also incredibly common. You see it everywhere. The singleton.
Singleton. That sounds kind of mysterious. Break it down for us.
Okay, so imagine this. You have this single, like universal object that different parts of your application need to use.
Gotcha.
The singleton pattern, what it does is it makes sure that you only create one instance of that object and that everyone, everywhere in your code, uses that same instance.
So it's like having one source of truth for that particular piece of information.
You got it. Think of it like a central control panel that everyone has access to, but no one can duplicate or mess with.
Ooh, that's a great visual. But I got to ask, are there any like downsides to using singletons? They seem really handy.
Oh, they can be super useful, especially when you're dealing with like limited resources, But like any powerful tool, they can be misused.
How so?
Well, if you're not careful, singletons can get like really tightly coupled to other parts of your code, and that can make it a real pain to change or update your application later on.
Ah, so it's all about finding that sweet spot between utility and like keeping your code flexible.
Exactly. Every pattern has its like strengths and weaknesses, and understanding those trade-offs, well, that's key for making smart design decisions.
That's really insightful. Now, I'm super curious about this proxy pattern I keep hearing about. What's the deal with that one?
Oh, the proxy pattern. Now that's a fascinating one. So picture this. You've got this object, right? And for whatever reason, you don't want to work with it directly.
Okay.
Maybe it's for security reasons. Maybe you need to control access to it. There are a bunch of reasons. A proxy, what it does is it acts as this go-between, this intermediary between your code and the actual object.
So it's like a bodyguard for your data.
Huh. That's one way to put it. So the proxy intercepts requests. It can add an extra layer of security, and it can even like modify the data that's being passed back and forth.
Okay, now that's starting to sound really powerful. Can you give us a real-world example of how a proxy might be used?
Absolutely. Let's say you're building an app that interacts with a database, right? You could use a proxy to control who has access to that database, making sure that only authorized users can read or change the data.
So it's like having a security checkpoint for your database.
You got it. Proxies give you this fine-grained control over how your objects are accessed and used, which can be really, really valuable.
This is all starting to click now.
Hmm.
Okay, so we've got singletons for managing those, like unique objects, and proxies for controlling access.
Right.
What other patterns are essential for, building applications that are both elegant and efficient?
Well, there's one that's completely revolutionized how we write JavaScript, especially in the last few years: hooks.
Hooks. I've heard that name thrown around a lot, but what makes them so special?
So, in the past, to add certain features to our web applications, you'd often end up writing like a ton of complex code. Hooks, they offer this simpler, more streamlined way to hook into a component's lifecycle and add stuff without all that extra code.
This is like giving developers superpowers.
Exactly. They make your code cleaner, more reusable, and way easier for others to understand. It's not an exaggeration to say that hooks have totally changed the game for how we build web applications today.
This is all so fascinating, but I have to ask, if hooks are so revolutionary, do they make those classic patterns, the singletons and proxies we talked about, do they make them obsolete?
That's a great question. While hooks definitely offer a more elegant solution in a lot of cases, they don't totally replace these classic patterns. It's more like an evolution, you
Think
know?
so?
There's still plenty of situations where singletons and proxies are the perfect tool for the job. The key is understanding the strengths of each approach and choosing the right one for your specific needs, what you're trying to accomplish.
That's a super helpful way to think about it. So it's not about picking sides. It's about understanding how these patterns have evolved and how they all fit together.
You got it. And learning patterns, it does a fantastic job of walking you through that evolution.
Now, I know some of our listeners might be feeling a little overwhelmed right now. So what's the key takeaway from all of this? Why should they care about design patterns, even if they're not, coding every day?
That's a fantastic question, and it gets to the heart of why I love talking about this stuff. You see, at their core, these patterns aren't really about writing code. They're about solving problems efficiently and elegantly. And those are skills that, let's be honest, they apply to pretty much every aspect of life.
So even if you're not building the next Facebook, understanding these patterns can still make you a better thinker, a better problem solver.
Absolutely. It can help you see the world in this new way, this more structured and logical way.
That's such a powerful idea.
It's not just about the code itself, it's about the thinking behind it.
I love that.
Right.
This is why I love doing the deep dive so much.
Yeah.
We take these concepts that might seem really complex on the surface, and we make them accessible and relevant to everyone. Well, we've only just scratched the surface of learning patterns. What other fascinating patterns are we going to uncover today?
Oh, we've got plenty more in store. Coming up next, we're going to delve into the world of providers and prototypes. Two patterns that are, let me tell you, absolutely crucial for building applications that can grow and evolve.
Ooh, can't wait. But first, a quick break. An expert speaker, when we talk about these patterns, it's like we're revealing the secret ingredients that make software, really sing.
I like that analogy. And just like with any good recipe, understanding the ingredients and how they all work together, that's the key.
100%. So what's next on our learning patterns menu? What other ingredients are we about to unlock?
Let's talk about the provider pattern. This one, it's all about managing data efficiently, especially when you're dealing with larger, more complex applications.
Data management. Yeah, that sounds like mission critical. Tell me more.
Okay, so imagine this. You have this critical piece of information, right? Let's say user settings or something. And that information needs to be accessible from all different parts of your application.
Okay, yeah, I can see how that could get messy really quickly if you're not careful.
Exactly. So instead of, passing that data around from one part of your code to another, like a hot potato, the provider pattern, it lets you make that data available globally, but within a specific part of your app. You know what I mean?
So it's like having this central hub for that data, and any component that needs it knows exactly where to go to get it.
You got it. It really simplifies the flow of data, it reduces redundancy, and it just makes your code way more organized and easier to work with.
Sounds like a win-win to me.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, does it make the data vulnerable? Could unauthorized parts of the application access it?
That's a great question. And you're right, security is always a concern. The key here is to implement the provider pattern within a well-defined scope. So you're making sure that data is only accessible to the components that are actually authorized to use it.
So it's like having secure access points rather than just leaving the data out in the open.
Exactly. And you can even combine the provider pattern with some of the other patterns we've talked about, like the proxy, to add even more layers of security and control.
This is starting to make me think about software architecture in this whole new way.
It's like we're peeling back the layers of an onion, right?
Right.
Speaking of layers, let's talk about the prototype pattern.
Okay.
This one goes deep into object-oriented programming and how we can like leverage the power of inheritance.
Inheritance. Ooh, that sounds complicated. Like we're building a digital family tree or something.
Uh-huh. In a way, yeah. So in essence, what the prototype pattern does is it allows you to create new objects based on existing ones, and these new objects, they inherit all the properties and methods of their, let's call them parent objects.
So it's like cloning an object, but you can customize the clone to have its unique traits.
Exactly. Imagine you're building like a video game,
Yeah.
right? And you've got all these different types of enemies.
Sure.
Instead of writing all the code for each enemy type from scratch, you could create this like base enemy prototype. This prototype, it would have all the common traits that enemies share.
Like their health points, how fast they move, their attack power, things like that.
Exactly. Then you could create specific enemy types, like, I don't know, goblin or dragon, that would inherit from that base enemy prototype. And then you could just add their unique characteristics on top of that.
So the goblin, it inherits all the basic stuff, but then maybe you give it a special ability, like, I don't know, it's really fast, right? And the dragon, maybe it has a fire-breathing attack or something?
You got it. It's an incredibly efficient way to create objects, especially as your projects get more and more complex.
This is making so much sense.
Yeah.
It's like we're building this family tree of objects, and each generation inherits traits from the one before it.
You're getting it. And the prototype pattern, it's really a cornerstone of JavaScript. Understanding it opens up so many possibilities for writing elegant, reusable code.
My mind is officially blown. But before we go too far down the prototype rabbit hole, I want to shift gears a bit. We've talked about patterns for like managing objects, data, code structure, all of that. But what about patterns for optimizing performance? Is that a thing?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Performance optimization, that's a huge part of web development. And there are tons of patterns specifically designed to make your applications, faster, smoother, just all around more enjoyable to use.
Okay, now you're speaking my language.
Yeah.
Everyone loves a fast website. So let's dive into that world a bit.
One of the most important techniques, especially for modern web apps, is server-side rendering, or SSR for short.
SSR. Okay, yeah, I've had that term thrown around. But I've always been too afraid to ask. What's the deal with server-side rendering?
It sounds kind of intimidating, I know. But at its core, SSR is about shifting some of the work that normally happens in the user's browser over to the server.
Okay, walk me through that. Like, what does it actually look like in practice?
So traditionally, when you visit a website, your browser, it downloads a bunch of files, right?
Right.
HTML, CSS, JavaScript, all that good stuff. And then your browser's JavaScript engine, it kicks in, it fetches any data that it needs, and then finally it renders the page you see on your screen.
Okay, yeah. That's kind of how I always imagined it worked. So where does SSR fit into all of that?
With SSR, instead of sending the browser like a blank HTML template and a bunch of JavaScripts to do all the work, the
Right.
server actually does the initial rendering of the page.
So the server pre-builds the page with all the content and data already in place.
Exactly. And then it sends this pre-rendered HTML to the browser, and the browser can display it almost instantly.
Okay, I see the benefit there. That means the user sees the content way faster because they're not waiting for their browser to do all the heavy lifting.
You got it. It dramatically improves what we call perceived performance, which is basically how quickly the user feels like the page is loading.
And in today's world, everyone wants things to load instantly.
You said it. Especially on mobile devices or slower connections, SSR can make a huge difference in user experience.
This is fascinating. So SSR is all about making websites feel snappier.
Right.
Are there any other benefits I should know about?
There are actually quite a few. One that's maybe not as obvious, but equally important is the impact of SSR on SEO.
SEO. Okay, yeah, that's huge for anyone who wants their website to show up in search results. But how does SSR help with that?
So search engines like Google, they use these things called bots to crawl websites and index their content.
Right.
And these bots, they primarily look for HTML content to understand what a page is about.
Right. HTML is like the foundation of any web page, so that makes sense.
Exactly.
Mm.
And with that traditional client-side rendering where the browser is doing most of the work, sometimes those bots, they actually arrive at a page before the JavaScript has finished rendering all the content.
So it's like the search engine is showing up to a party before all the decorations are set up, and they're just seeing an empty room.
Haha, perfect analogy. And because those bots aren't seeing the fully rendered content, it can really hurt your website's ranking in the search results.
That makes a ton of sense. But with SSR, because the content is already there, Those bots, they get the full picture from the get-go.
Exactly. SSR helps make sure that all that awesome content on your website is easily discoverable by those search engines, which can be a game changer for your SEO performance.
This is gold, expert speaker. I'm starting to see SSR in this whole new light now. It's not just about speed, it's about making sure your website is actually visible.
Absolutely. And as more and more websites rely on JavaScript, SSR is only becoming more and more important for making sure websites perform well and are easy to find.
Okay, I'm sold. SSR sounds like it should be a no-brainer for any modern website. But I've got to confess, I always kind of assumed SSR was this, like, super complex thing to implement.
I hear you. It definitely can be a bit more involved than traditional, client-side rendering. But the good news is that modern frameworks and tools have made it way more approachable.
Oh, good. So what are some of the popular frameworks for implementing SSR? Any recommendations for our listeners who are, like, eager to dive in and get their hands dirty?
Well, if you're working with React, which is a very popular JavaScript library, Next.js is a complete game changer.
Next.js, I've heard that name thrown around. What makes it so great for SSR?
Next.js was built from the ground up with performance and SEO in mind. It has built-in support for SSR, plus a ton of other optimizations that make your life as a developer so much easier.
So it's like Next.js takes care of all the complicated SSR stuff behind the scenes, and you could just focus on building your application.
Exactly. It streamlines the entire process and makes SSR practically effortless.
This is fantastic. I'm putting Next.js on my list of things to learn ASAP. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, why don't we take a quick pause? When we come back, I want to hear more about how Next.js actually works its SSR magic. All right, so we're back, and I am so ready to really dig into this whole Next.js thing and all its server-side rendering superpowers. Before the break, we were talking about how Next.js makes SSR almost like a walk in the park for developers. Expert speaker, I got to know, how does Next.js actually pull this off? Is it all smoke and mirrors, or is there some real magic happening under the hood?
Oh, it's definitely not smoke and mirrors. Next.js, it has this really clever approach to SSR. It uses something called, get this, automatic static optimization.
Okay, that sounds pretty impressive. But I'm not going to lie, it also sounds a little bit like, tech jargon.
Yeah.
Break it down for me. What does automatic static optimization actually mean?
Right. So basically, it means that Next.js is smart enough to figure out the absolute best way to render every single page of your application.
Okay.
So for pages that are mostly static content, things like, I don't know, a blog post or an About Us page, Next.js can actually pre-render those pages ahead of time during what we call the build process.
So it's like Next.js creates these snapshots of the pages in advance, so they're ready to go the second someone clicks on them.
Exactly. And because those pre-rendered pages are just plain HTML, they load insanely fast, and they're amazing for SEO.
That makes perfect sense. But what about those pages that are a bit more, dynamic? Like a product page that needs to pull data from a database, or a user profile page that changes based on who's logged in.
So for those more dynamic pages, Next.js, it seamlessly switches over to, you guessed it, server-side rendering. It renders the page on the server, fetches all the data it needs, and then boom, it sends that perfectly rendered HTML straight to the browser.
For the user, they get that super fast initial load, and then once the JavaScript kicks in, the page becomes interactive.
You nailed it. It's the best of both worlds. Blazing fast static rendering when you need it, and dynamic SSR when you need that too.
And the best part is that Next.js handles all of this automatically. I don't have to write a bunch of complex configuration files or anything.
Exactly. You can just focus on building your application, and Next.js takes care of all the heavy lifting behind the scenes.
That's what I love about these modern frameworks. They just handle all the complicated stuff for you.
Right. And Next.js, it goes even further. It has all these built-in features for optimizing images, fonts, even those third-party scripts that can really slow things down.
It's like Next.js is the ultimate Swiss Army knife for front-end performance. I'm super impressed.
And we haven't even talked about everything. Next.js also has this cool thing called API routes for building serverless functions, and then there's incremental static regeneration, which is a mouthful, but it basically keeps your content up to date without having to rebuild your whole website every time something changes.
Okay, you're definitely speaking my love language now. Those features sound amazing, but maybe a bit too advanced for our deep dive today.
Right.
We've covered so much ground already. We talked about why design patterns are important, how they work, the power of server-side rendering, and we even demystified Next.js a bit. Expert speaker, as we wrap things up, what are some key takeaways you hope our listeners will take with them from this deep dive?
I think the biggest takeaway here is that building great software, it's about so much more than just like knowing how to write code.
Yeah.
It's about really understanding these fundamental principles of software design, leveraging those battle-tested patterns, and always, always striving for elegance, efficiency, making sure your code is easy to work with and maintain.
It's like thinking about the big picture, not just the immediate task at hand.
100%. We're building software that's, hopefully going to last, that other developers can easily understand and work on, and that can adapt and grow over time.
That's a really important point. And the journey never ends,
Yeah.
right? There are always new patterns to learn, new technologies to explore. It's constantly evolving.
That's the beauty of it, and that's what makes it so exciting.
I love that. So to all our listeners out there, never stop learning, never stop experimenting, and, embrace the challenge of diving deep into this amazing world of software development. Expert speaker, it's always such a pleasure having you on. And thank you so much for joining us today on this deep dive into learning patterns.
The pleasure was all mine.
And to everyone listening out there, keep those minds sharp, keep those learning journeys going strong, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.